We're beginning with part two of miracles. I'll give you a sort of outline breakdown of what were the major parts of this presentation. Each one will correspond to a visual. Again, I show visuals of art that I've collected. My wife and I are fortunate to travel, and when we do, we always stop by some sort of center of culture, a nice museum, and we just walk around, and I take my phone and enjoy the sights, and hopefully collect some images to share with you at my yearly Lewis presentations. So the four major parts for tonight. The first two, which we'll cover before break, we'll have a break about an hour into it. The first two will deal with challenges to the conception of miracles. Lewis is basically saying there is a side of the debate or argument, if you will, that does not want to sort of buy into this idea of miracles, that has certain objections to miracles, and he will lay those out. Those first are our first two parts before break. After break, I will share with you what Lewis would say perhaps would be the gifts we are able to receive if we begin to engage with this idea of what miracles are. And again, towards the end, this should come a bit more fleshed out towards the end. Okay. I'm a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, where we were weaned on the Socratic method. So don't be surprised if I sort of stop every now and then just to ask a question, just to get a little bit of discussion going, to make us think about things a bit more three-dimensionally with regards to that. So what we'll be doing is with these major parts, criticisms towards miracles, and then gifts relating to miracles. What we'll be doing is sharing images, but before that, going over certain quotes from Lewis. Okay, I'll be reading those. I'll be sharing the page numbers. This is my copy, by the way, just so we're familiar. I'll share the page number and the chapter, just so if you have a different version of the book, so we can proceed from there. Okay. This is chapter 11, Christianity and Religion. So again, from Miracles, chapter 11, Christianity and Religion. It is found on page 129 in my copy, 129. This is the second sentence down from the first full paragraph, beginning with "the Christians say." Do you guys see that? The Christians say, if you have your book. Okay? The Christians say that God has done miracles. The modern world, even when it believes in God, and even when it has been seen the defenselessness of nature, does not. It thinks God would not do that sort of thing. Have we any reason for supposing that the modern world is right? I agree that the sort of God conceived by the popular, in quotes, religion of our own times would almost certainly work no miracles. The question is whether that popular religion is at all likely to be true. Second quote from page 130. Middle of the page, sentence beginning with "the popular religion." The popular religion. The popular religion, in quotes, excludes miracles because it excludes the living God of Christianity and believes instead in a kind of God who obviously would not do miracles or indeed anything else. This popular religion may roughly be called pantheism, and we must now examine its credentials. As to the credentials of pantheism, on page 131, these are all sort of interconnected, these quotes. So on page 131, second sentence of the middle of the page, first full paragraph, beginning with "pantheism certainly." Pantheism certainly. Pantheism certainly, as its advocates would say, is congenial to the modern mind. But the fact that a shoe slips on so easily does not prove that it is a new shoe, much less that it will keep your feet dry. Pantheism is congenial to our minds, not because it is the final stage in a slow process of enlightenment, but because it is almost as old as we are. It may even be the most primitive of all religions. And the orenda of a savage tribe has been interpreted by some to be an all-pervasive spirit. It is immemorial in India. The Greeks rose above it only at their peak in the thought of Plato and Aristotle. their successors relapsed into the great pantheistic system of the Stoics. With these three quotes in mind, Lewis introduces us to the religion of those who disbelieve in a God who would cause miracles. Those who oppose Christianity are not irreligious necessarily, but instead are adherents of their own religion. Anger, it seems, is incited when these adherents are presented the Christian divinity or God who acts purposefully, issuing imperatives and prohibitions. This is pantheism, which we met back in when we were doing Mere Christianity, actually. This makes an appearance in that book as well. This entails, what does this pantheism entail? Again, from my reading of what Lewis is saying, this entails inventing spiritual entities to make sense of nature. We see this, by the way, earliest of all places in Mesopotamia and in Egypt as well. We have gods of the storm, gods of the sun, etc. A later version of this would be the Greek pantheon of gods. We try to make sense of nature, so we invent spiritual entities representing these. In the very beginning, these entities and these divinities are anthropomorphic. They resemble humans. I think as a freshman at St. John's College, we had to read Homer's Iliad as the very first assignment. And within a few weeks of that, begin translating Homer's Iliad from the Greek. Zeus was the bearer of the storm. Yes, the earth shaker, I believe, was Poseidon. So all of these gods had command of a certain section of nature. So according to pantheists, we make sense of what we see in nature. So we invent these human-like divinities to represent what these stand for. But what happens is very interesting. According to pantheism, as humanity evolves forward, as we go further and further into time, forward and more forward into time, these entities begin diminishing in terms of anthropomorphism. They become more and more abstract. Their physical images as people, very powerful people with lightning bolts and tridents, are no longer there. Rather, they sort of dissipate, in a sense, into a much more abstract form. Crucial here, by the way, to this understanding of moving forward in time, my late dean at St. John's College, Eva T.H. Brand, who escaped the Nazis, last boat out of Portugal, and was a long-standing member of the St. John's faculty for about 6 decades. She makes a point that modernism borrows from Christianity in the sense that it presupposes that the move forward, what is often called progress, is going to lead to a positive conclusion. In Christianity, of course, this makes sense because we are moving forwards to a day where we will one day be able to see God in the face. But modernity borrows from this and says, no, we can, in a sense, immanentize the eschaton. We can bring that heaven here now. We will move forward and forward in time, and things get better and better. Of course, the natural question to this is, how do we know this? And what exactly is the better end of this long process? So pantheists believe that as time goes forward, gods become more and more abstract. But according to the pantheist mind, they also become better. Better than their earlier anthropomorphic selves. Now, that is kind of a head scratcher. Yes, people who do believe in that kind of progress do believe things get better. But why would the more abstract nature of gods be better? What is more beneficial or benevolent about divinities that no longer look like men and women up in Olympus, but that now are more abstract?
It's easier to deal with an abstraction.
Okay, how so?
Less is required of us.
Less is required of us.
Yeah, a personal God requires a relationship, which is more difficult than just looking at ideas.
Right. Okay, so in a sort of a more concrete form, we're no longer making sacrifices of birds to Zeus and Hades. So we are more distanced from the divinity.
With
This,
abstraction, yes.
so this would be good because we don't have to make those sacrifices anymore. Very
I
good.
didn't say good. I said
Okay.
easier.
Easier.
Yeah.
Okay. So it takes less work from us in that sense to have a relationship. Less work, perhaps more time in our hands. Think of it this way: the less human divinities become, again, we're following Lewis's logic, the more abstract they become, the less empathetic they will be to humans. This is not to say, by the way, that the gods of the Greeks were very empathetic towards humans. They may be sometimes when they liked you. But if they didn't like you, that wasn't really a good situation. If you've read Ajax by Sophocles, Athena pulls a number on him that's quite tragic, obviously. Um, but if gods become less and less human, they have less and less empathy towards us. But that also grants us, in a way, a bit more, dare I say, freedom. We don't have to follow basically what these gods would lay down as norms or mores to keep human nature in check. Now, Lewis states this theoretical process of moving or this progression is not true. It is appealing to us not because it is such an evolutionary product, which is what pantheists say. That it's really, really cool, it's really, really great because it goes forward and it's more and more enlightened and more abstract. Lewis says, rather, it is appealing to us because it's ancient. It's very, very old. It's perhaps the oldest form of humanity dealing with some sort of divinity. It has been with us through the ages. And uniquely enough, on the next page, there's another line where he says, the only rivals, the only true nemesis or collective nemesis of this pantheistic view of progression towards the abstract are three things. Well, three people, or three schools, so to speak: Judaism, Christianity, and Plato. All those three stood against this very, very old process in this sort of evolutionary process of divinity. It is, as Lewis says, uniquely enough, something that becomes assimilated into the modern mind through philosophers like Hegel, who many 19th century American philosophers will sort of adopt and basically take on as the proper way of viewing religion and philosophy. It is a system of belief wherein religion is about what we determine about God instead of vice versa. It puts us into the driver's seat, so to speak. If we are, as this process says, if we are inventing human-like beings to describe natural phenomena, then we have the keys to the car, so to speak, yes? I mean, we are the ones dictating this relationship, not having to take some sort of guidance or interference from the transcendent, from something that's beyond nature. So I'd like to share with you now our first visual for today. This painting is found at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. By the way, fantastic place to look for art in. It's called The Fall of Man, and the artist is a Dutch artist called Hendrik Goltzius. He lived between 1558 and 1617, and this painting was produced a year before he passed away in 1616. So roughly Baroque period, Baroque era of painting. Goltzius was a printmaker in his previous life, an engraver, but only gets into painting a little bit later on in his life. He has an interesting physical feature. His right hand, I believe it's his right hand, was impaired since childhood. And because he becomes so famous in his art, when he travels to Italy, which many of the Flemish and Dutch artists did at the time to get inspiration from Italian artists, when he travels to Italy, Goltzius, uniquely enough, has to conceal himself, especially his hand, because his hand is known to be only him, and he's a famous figure, sort of a celebrity of that time. Now, he was influenced, as research shows, by Titian and Rubens. Those are not shabby as far as being influencers. What would shape your art and at least having a focus on that. There is a write-up from the National Gallery. I'll cover this a little bit and I'll give you my own take from the painting. If you look at this painting, it focuses, of course, it's the fall of man. So it focuses on Adam and Eve taking the fruit and a little bit later on being cast out of Eden. Um, but if you look at it, there are different animals in the picture. This is from the description of the National Gallery. It's a little small over here, but this is an elephant way over here. And I guess it's important that it's far away. An elephant was a symbol at this time of the Christian charities or virtues of piety, chastity, and temperance. None of which, by the way, are found in this particular scene over here. So hence the artist putting the elephant way over in this side, removed from the scene. The other animals who are present, the two goats, symbolism for this, of course, compared to sheep or lamb, they're not exactly paragons of purity or virtue, again, to sort of hint to a lack of chastity that is occurring in this scene. Way over here, this rather unhappy looking cat at the lower left-hand corner. This cat is symbolic, acting in a way as a judge, letting us know that there are certain things that ought to be enjoyed and certain things which are prohibited from being enjoyed. Now, my own little take on this painting. Along with mutual seduction, which is what the museum says is occurring in the scene, as Adam and Eve seducing each other and eventually taking the fruit. What really stands out, at least from my eye, is there is just in this whole, just if you take away the animals, just right around here, there is an unalloyed sense of just focusing on self, of having nothing else matter. There are no animals here. There is no landscape in Eden. There is no elephant very far away. All that we're worried about is ourselves. So much so is this focus on the self, so heavy and overbearing is this focus on the self, that the animals themselves look like they're a bit perturbed. They're almost disturbed. What is this new creature who is ignoring the rest of creation only to focus so solely on themselves? What they are meant for by God in this situation is not important. Look at the eyes of Adam and Eve, completely engrossed with each other. No care at all for anything that's happening anywhere else. Uniquely enough, the serpent, way up here, we can see its body and neck, and right over here is its head. Unique in that Goltzius paints it this way. It's very cherubic. It's very childlike as an image. It's not a scary monster or even a reptilian snake. It's almost like a child at the end of a long snake-like body. Focus on this temptation. The temptation, of course, in this scene, yes, is ye shall be as gods. That's all it really took. If you partake of this fruit, you will get to that state of being. When we are as gods, we get to decide what God is, going back to pantheism. Remember again, Lewis says the logic of pantheism goes that we come up with religion, we come up with this form of belief as a way of explaining nature. Not worried about, by the way, what is beyond nature. It is solely focused on the here and now. And acting like gods means we don't want to worry with this divine being. We are ourselves self-appointed divine beings. And that, of course, is a term I learned a long time ago reading Homer's Iliad, especially with regards to Achilles. A word comes to mind, hubris, a form of ruinous pride that comes about when we only focus on ourselves, when we have not a care toward nature, and we have not a care to what is beyond nature. And what stands against this? Three things, according to Lewis. Plato's writings, as voiced, of course, by Socrates first, then Judaism, then Christianity. But apart from those three things, those three schools, if you will, Lewis is saying this is the default setting. This is how human beings essentially are wired. And it takes those three things, or one of those three things, to show us another way. Any questions on the painting or this presentation on pantheism so far?
How do you spell the artist's name, last name?
Yeah, the last name is Goltzius.
Wouldn't Lewis today want to add Islam in opposition to pantheism?
Because it has a God who is transcending nature. So by that logic, he would be included.
Even to the extent of being anti-incarnational.
Right.
The avoidance of any kind of picturing, as was the case with Orthodox Judaism as well.
Right. Well, from those points, you might say, yes, I mean, Lewis would allow that little bit of room, but uniquely enough, he doesn't. He says it's those three things that fall in line, that work with each other.
I suppose there's just so much more of an ascendancy of Islam in our time than there was when he was doing most of his writing.
Yes, he does say, if I'm not mistaken, I think he points this out in Mere Christianity. He does say, when he discussed pantheism there in Mere Christianity, he says there are different kinds of worldviews, and the specific school of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam views religion as having a benevolent God who comes and affects nature and the reality that we know, whereas pantheists viewed nature as everything. There's nothing transcending. So in that sense, yes, Islam would be part of the school of the Abrahamic school, I guess, of having a transcendent being stepping into history and affecting it.
I have a question about the word chastity here.
Okay.
How is that applied to this painting? I'm not understanding how this is not a chaste painting.
I'm just sort of going with Lewis's logic here. Once the transgression is committed, the eating of the fruit, there is the realization later on that we've done something bad. And one of the first things that Adam and Eve will eventually do, there's another painting I've shown years before of Adam and Eve being cast out of Eden by the painter Masaccio from Florence. It's found at a small church in Florence, and that's Adam and Eve covering themselves. Like, not necessarily, I mean, here they're already kind of covered, but it's them realizing that there's something to be shameful of.
But would that really be a Christian attitude that sexual activity is not necessarily chaste? I think that's kind of a wrong idea.
Okay, all right. What would be the more appropriate word? Again, that the word chaste was cut from the National Gallery's description. But
yeah, that's why I'm saying I think that should not even be a word used.
So what would be more suitable?
Well, I would not use that word. I don't see this being unchaste.
Okay.
Because man and woman together, this is what God created them for, right? So,
yes.
So that's kind of a weird. I mean, I understand what the painting is pointing at, but I don't think chastity has anything to do with it.
Well noted. Perhaps in this light, that again, this is from the National Gallery's description. There is a hint of seduction happening, mutual seduction from both Adam and Eve, and seducing you to what end? If the telos or end of the seduction, or the point of the seduction, is to commit this original transgression, this original sin, then perhaps I agree with you that could be that's a debatable sort of a word in the inclusion with regards to the piece. Very good.
But the fruit that they eat is the tree of knowledge. So once again, it's a sidelight. I mean, we can drop that. I just thought it was kind of an interesting word to include.
Very good. Okay. Any other questions before we progress towards the next quote?
This is a sideline on a sideline. I guess.
Okay.
But I think it's significant. Thomas Aquinas argues that had there not been a fall, sexuality would be still more attractive and more fulfilling than it is now, simply because with the fall, there's a disordering of reason, and were reason not disordered, it's not as if there would be no sexuality, but it would be more fully human, more rational, more embracing, to use that word, than it is now. And very often in our experience of sexuality today, there's a kind of power struggle, which would not have been the case, Aquinas thinks, had there not been the fall. This is material for all sorts of reflection, which doesn't belong here, but it's an indication that there are these avenues that are very rich avenues to pursue.
Following from Aquinas' thinking, as you said, could possibly the now after the fall, the presence of death itself also affect the relationship in that way? It's more full in the sense that they didn't have that risk before for Adam and Eve.
Yes.
Right? Perhaps possibly. Okay. Very good. Next quote right now we're proceeding to from Lewis. Again, we're still in the field of criticisms towards miracles. This is from page 156. Let me get to there and I'll give you the chapter. So this is the chapter called The Propriety of Miracles. The Propriety of Miracles. I have this on page 156. Scroll about 3/4 of the way down the page. There is a sentence beginning with, "Now there is no doubt. Now there is no doubt."
Let me ask a favor. What's the first few words of the paragraph? Because I don't have the same page numbers.
It's the first of the paragraph. I'm going back to the previous page. How a miracle can be no inconsistency. So if you scroll down from there, sentence beginning with, "Now there is no doubt." Now there is no doubt that a great deal of the modern objection to miracles is based on the suspicion that they are marvels of the wrong sort, that a story or certain kind of a certain kind, nature, is arbitrarily interfered with to get the characters out of a difficulty by events that do not really belong to that kind of story. Some people probably think of the resurrection as a desperate last-moment expedient to save the hero from a situation which had got out of the author's control. And on page 157, next paragraph over, the reader may set his mind at rest, according to Lewis. If I thought miracles were like that, I should not believe in them. If they have occurred because they are the very thing this universal story is about. They are not exceptions, however rarely they occur, nor irrelevancies. They are precisely those chapters in this great story on which the plot turns. Death and resurrection are what the story is about, and had we but eyes to see it, this has been hinted on every page, met us in some disguise at every turn, and even been muttered in conversations between such minor characters, if they are minor characters, as the vegetables. Lewis brings up a prevalent complaint about miracles, in that they serve as some sort of deus ex machina, some sort of like a God in the machine of sorts, an imposition on nature, presumably from a God, which, by the way, modernists don't really believe in anyway. But they are not flukes, as Lewis is saying, so to speak. Instead, they hint of points of the narrative that are hinge points, the core, essentially, of the narrative. Death and resurrection are hence not plot devices. They constitute the core of the story. Let me share our next image. If you're local in the Bay Area, at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco. Wonderful location, by the way, small plug. It's one of my favorite places in the city, so it's a good place to go to. This is called Christ at the Column, painted in 1632 by Peter de Grebber, last name spelled Degrebeber. Peter de Grebber. De Grebber lived between 1600 and 1652. He lived a generation or half a generation after Goltzius. This is one of those synchronistic moments that you don't plan on when you're doing research. When I gathered the visuals for this presentation, I had the Goltzius Fall of Man, and then I had this image from two different places. Yes, National Gallery in DC, and then Legion of Art Museum. I then find out with the research that I'm doing for this presentation that de Gruyber, painter of this particular work, was actually a student of Goltzius. So a little bit of serendipity there, how they sort of like, sort of go into each other. De Gruyber was a leading painter in the style known as Haarlem Classicism. Haarlem, by the way, with the two A's, the city in the Netherlands. This style was derived inspiration from Rubens's Baroque style. And perhaps, this is my 2 cents here with the painting, there are elements from Caravaggio, the great Italian Baroque painter. There is this use of light, what light is shining on, where is it shining from, that is very much key to Caravaggio's own painting. Considering that Caravaggio influenced Rubens, who himself influenced de Gruyber, this sort of makes sense. De Gruyber's art was made manifest during a period of great conflict. His Catholic belief was banned in the Netherlands, so most likely this work was found in one of the secret underground churches in Haarlem. This said, it is furthermore likely that it was crafted to convey a very, very immediate message in very stark terms, coalescing a very, very powerful narrative for the viewer. If we look at the color elements of the painting, we have lots of almost monochromatic color elements. What is usually found when we see Jesus and the Virgin Mary as well, if you look all the way back at Byzantine art, that's the art, of course, of 1,000 years ago, you will find the great use of blue and red. Blue, of course, symbolizing purity, and the red symbolizing the passion. There is red here, but it's a little bit different. It's not red as a form of clothing. Leaving out those colors, the viewer focuses on on what is emphasized with the light. The pose of Christ with the hands bound, the body twisted in this way, not standing straight, is one evocative of sacrifice. A quick note on sacrifice, a citation I think that merits being made. There is a distinguished professor of history out of Yale University called Carlos Eyre. He is a historian of religion, essentially. His research on miracles, by the way, he has several books on the concept of the issue of miracles, and these are strongly recommended on my part. He points out something rather interesting, does Carlos Eyre. He points out that uniquely in Christ, we have a situation with regards to sacrifice, where Christ is both priest and the sacrifice, simultaneously as one. Before I share a little bit about my thinking on this, what do you think about this concept of having both? There have been sacrifices, obviously, much earlier even than the ancient Hebrews. Mesopotamia had their own version, the Egyptians had their own version. Even a civilization that is perceived to be as enlightened as the ancient Minoans, the ancestors, if you will, of Greek civilization, they had those sacrifices, and human sacrifices, by the way, in their labyrinths. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur does not come out of a vacuum. There were these occurrences already happening. But what do we make of this scenario wherein we have a priest who is also the sacrifice? Why that? Any thoughts on this?
It's satisfying to think of both functions occurring at the same time by one person.
Satisfying for us or for
us, for
Okay.
my thinking.
Okay, because
I'm not sure why.
okay, it's more neat in a way, or satisfying.
Yeah, symmetrical. It's neat.
Okay. All right, sure. Why else?
The thing that comes to mind for me is something completely different than this. And that would be the Mesoamerican priests that would basically sacrifice themselves by, taking like barbed wire kind of stuff and running it through their tongues or cutting their ears or mutilating themselves. But I can't think of any other cultures where the priest and the sacrifice are one and the same. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, wholly unique, I think, to this, yes? I was doing some thinking on this a little bit earlier and speaking with my wife about this. The sacrifice, in this sense, has to be sinless. It's only Christ who can do this, yes? Who can take on all of the sins of humanity into himself and then be sacrificed. But why does he also have to be the one doing the sacrifice?
In his human nature, he prayed that there not be this sacrifice.
Mhm.
So it's in his human nature that he is sacrificed.
Yes.
In his divine nature, he does not act other than his Father does or other than the Spirit does. Anything that can be said of him with regard to suffering is, first of all, centered in his human nature.
Yes.
But nonetheless, his human nature and divine nature don't somehow give rise to two persons. There is one person, three persons in one God, but one God. So there is, in the character of the Trinity, the logical space for being both the priest and the sacrifice.
Very well put. There isn't a Manichaean conflict happening, as you're saying, yes? There isn't a man and God who are separate from each other.
No.
Okay. Very much, or having communion between the two, well,
yes,
as a whole being. I started thinking about this, and well put, by the way. What if this sacrifice of an innocent, sinless being had a priest who was not Christ as the officiating body? Why would that not work? In a sense, there was, right? The Romans were crucifying him. But this particular sacrifice for our sins cannot have human hands directly on it. It has to be Christ himself who is the priest, the officiator of this process. If we could do it
other than God the Father,
right,
or Christ in his divine nature,
yep,
serving as the priest,
right,
be blasphemous.
It would be. What would it be saying? That blasphemy, what would it be communicating?
Somehow a power over God himself.
Yes. And that somehow we had this within our power as human beings to make the sacrifice to remove sin, which of course leads to a great sense of hubris. It's a small but odd correlation, but Frodo, as he's up on Mount Doom in The Lord of the Rings and The Return of the King, Tolkien is very careful in writing that, making sure that Frodo is not himself throwing the ring in. In a sense, then Frodo can turn around and say, look at me, I destroyed sin. But Tolkien, a very faithful Catholic, would say that's the first step towards pride. And you can't do that. That's not within your province to do. So again, going back to the painting, Christ's pose is one of sacrifice. There is meekness instead of anger. That his robe is off his shoulders points to his torture and the scorn that was heaped on him. Odd object over here. This looks like this rod over here. Perhaps an instrument of torture. Looks like some sort of thing you would be beaten with. There is blood on his sides. Not yet the piercing because he's not on the cross yet. And this brought to mind to me, in Florence, there is a church called the Santa Maria Novella. It's right by the train station. I believe it's the Dominican church in Florence. The Santa Croce is the Franciscan church. Inside the Santa Maria Novella, there is a hanging crucifix produced by the artist, I believe it's Giotto, who was a pre-Renaissance artist. It is one of the first examples in very, very early European art showing Christ's suffering. And he does this by showing basically the blood coming out of a cut on the side as he's on the crucifix. So when I saw this, it sort of evoked that image a little bit in seeing it. His hands and feet, very interesting feature. Even though there's not a whole lot of color, the hands especially, they look like they're getting a little gray. This is evocative, of course, of his oncoming death. He is bleeding from his head, but it seems that there is also a source of light in the painting. Coming, sort of surrounding his head. This imagery, by the way, of the crowning with the thorns and the blood, the red sort of standing out amidst a very monochromatic backdrop. If you're familiar with a piece of music by Bach called the St. Matthew's Passion, it's a sacred oratorio, and there's a hymn from that piece of music from the German O Haupt voll Blut und Wunden, O sacred head now wounded. There's a line from the St. Matthew's Passion. How are you turned pallid? Who has treated those eyes to which no light is comparable so shamefully? Sort of this image evoked that a little bit, this very sad, sort of tragic image of someone who is a king, but being abused in this manner. The blood on the crown of thorns is surrounded by a halo of light, indicating his death will bring about our salvation. Contra what is maintained by modernists, as we were discussing earlier, those who see miracles as simply odd or weird interferences by the divine into nature. Christ's death and resurrection are not aberrations or an easy way out of a story's conflict. It is rather that this is the core of the story. It is necessary at a certain point, Lewis is, I think, saying, to set aside human hubris in assuming anthropocentrism that every story revolves around us. It is not possible, whatever the strength from human hands is employed, for us to save ourselves. There is this unique sacrifice that can only be done in this way. What is required is something suspending the rules of nature. That again is what Lewis mentions last week in the first part of our presentation, that yes, there are rules of nature, but every now and then they can be suspended. In order to ultimately benefit the plight of humanity, no matter how stubborn we are. In the modern mind, this humility is undermined by the belief that all can be conceived and completed by human minds and hands. And Lewis, I think, is saying in this portion of the presentation that this is something that ought to be avoided. We discover what hubris is in Mere Christianity, where he points out that pride is the worst of all the sins because it is inherently competitive. You're always comparing yourself to somebody else and wanting more. And Lewis is touching on that again in this presentation in Miracles in a different way, but pointing out perhaps that our resistance to relating or perhaps even accepting the possibility of miracles is because of this aboriginal hubris, so to speak. This is something that's always been there. This is something that keeps us from opening up to this possibility. Any questions on this particular painting by de Gruyter?
Not on this painting, but I would question your statement about Giotto.
Sure.
There's plenty of images of Christ being crucified and suffering into the 800s and 900s. So I'm a little bit interested in why you're saying Giotto is the first.
When you look at Byzantine art before that time period, right? What is usually notable about the faces in Byzantine art? Do you usually see suffering?
When you say Byzantine, are you talking about Eastern Empire or are you talking about Western Empire?
For a very long time, Christian art was, that sort of the Byzantine school, that sort of very flat, what we see in Ravenna, what we see in San Marco.
It's very stylized suffering.
Okay, so let me give you an example. Gero crucifix from 800, 900, somewhere around there. Christ is on a cross and his head is down and he's not enjoying himself. He's basically dead. Okay. So that's why I'm asking about what it is that you say that Giotto does that makes it suffering.
The crucifix of Giotto in the Santa Maria Novella not only has the wound on the side, it has the downturned head, as you said, and not smiling in a stoic manner, as you see Byzantine art or Eastern art during that time period, where they're very stoic sort of faces that sort of look directly at you. The point to Greek art, I studied this some time back. It's really a contemplative way of looking at art, where we're supposed to conceive of heaven or something beyond this world.
Oh, I understand all that, but I'm just pointing out there are plenty instances where that's not the case. Okay. In European art.
I'd like to see some of that.
Centuries earlier.
All right. Okay.
Look up Gero crucifix.
Okay, I shall. Okay, very good.
So anyway,
the reason I brought the Giotto out is that
back to Lewis.
Sure. The reason, just to address your point, the reason I brought that out with regards to Giotto is the particular crucifix he has in Florence during that time period, Franciscans are sort of having more and more influence in Italy. And of course, that is in the Dominican church. But with the influence and the spread of the Franciscan version of Catholicism is pretty much geared towards the poor, of spreading it not only to very informed people or people who go to school, but for the general poor of the city. And they found this particular medium of showing suffering at this time period as a very good avenue to reach out through the faith. That's the reason I sort of brought that up. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Mark, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that there's a hymn written by, I think, a Canadian lady called Margaret Clarkson, in which the first line is priest and victim, Jesus dies.
So he's both the priest and sacrifice in
Yes.
that. Could you give me the name again? I'm going to look that up. Okay.
I think it's Clarkson, Margaret Clarkson.
Got it. Okay.
What is that band across Christ's shoulder and under his armpit?
That, I believe, is to hold up the cloak that he was given in mockery.
Oh,
He was given the sort of robes to show that he's a king. But being disheveled, right? His shoulders are now bare. It's a further act of humiliation, attempted humiliation by the authorities at that time.
And those little red touches of blood are probably due to the flagellation.
Very much so. You see them on the side here, a
Yes.
hint of it over here, too, and by his legs. We see, by the way, down here, the instrument of the flagellation, the tools of the torture. We're going to take our quick break. We'll be right back, and we'll carry forward with the second part of the presentation. Hello, all again. Returning to our third part now with the presentation, let me draw you to the first of the two gifts, as I mentioned earlier, that are available perhaps to us because of the potential for miracles. This is found on page 196. The chapter is called The Grand Miracle. It's close to the bottom of the page, and it begins with the sin both of men and of angels. The sin both of men and of angels. The sin both of men and of angels was rendered possible by the fact that God gave them free will, thus surrendering a portion of his omnipotence. It is again a death-like or descending movement, because he saw that from a world free of creatures, even though they fell, he could work out, and this is the reascent, a deeper happiness and fuller splendor than any world of automata would admit. From what Lewis said, following from the emphasis on departing from anthropomorphism, which we found in the last chapter before we took our break, Lewis writes of something, though perhaps in itself a miracle, that gives us a glimpse into God's divine intention. Giving people free will is akin to God, according to him, relinquishing a share of his omnipotence. When I read this, preparing for this presentation, I had to basically stop and think about that a little bit. This is quite challenging to contemplate for anyone, a philosophy person, if you're new to philosophy. If omnipotence means without limits, then how can it be quantifiably diminished? A sort of a slice of omnipotence, in a way, taken off and given to people in the form of free will. Our minds are incapable of imagining God's own omnipotence. It is so far beyond our ability to even grasp intellectually. But perhaps we can try to make sense of this act of surrender. A more profound state of happiness is reached via people, which is very unlikely, than simply people being programmed to be virtuous. When Lewis mentions automata, we're not created good in a fixed state of being good all the time. There are echoes of Christ's descent into death here, as it is meant to lead to this superior happiness. We have difficulty imagining this as it goes against human self-preservation and selfishness, as if we cannot or will not contemplate a God who is this willing to give, who is this giving. And next image from today. This painting is from 1887. I take a small degree of pride in this. This is found in the National Museum of the Philippines in Manila. The artist who painted this is Felix Resurrección Hidalgo, one of the great Filipino painters of the 19th century. It is called La Barca de Aqueronte, or the Boat of Acheron, The river Acheron, by the way, is the river of pain, or the river of woe in the Greek underworld, where Charon, the boatman, brings you to your final resting place in the underworld. Hidalgo, the painter, who lived between 1853 and 1913, he passed away in Barcelona in Spain. He was a decorated artist who worked during the waning years of Spanish rule in the Philippines. He was one of a generation of artists who were feted in Europe, despite hailing from a colonial possession. Hidalgo was rather celebrated in Europe, especially Spain. Despite hailing from this place, he accomplished great prizes. I'll mention one in a second. His work features prominently at the National Museum in Manila, and he was the recipient of a gold medal in 1887 at the Exposición General de las Islas Filipinas, a festival of art, so to speak, held in Madrid that year. The painting shows a scene inspired by the Inferno of Dante. Charon the boatman ferries damned souls to the land of the dead. Contrasting to other versions of this imagery of being brought by the boatman to the underworld, there's a bit of a difference in this particular painting by Hidalgo. This trip is not one of quiet resignation, of a placid descent into hell, so to speak. Rather, instead, there is turbulence in the river itself. There is turbulence in the writhing bodies of the souls who are on this river. If you're familiar with manneristic painting, Michelangelo would use a bit of mannerism in his art, where you have all of these bodies moving upward into space in contorted fashion. A couple of hundred years after mannerism was introduced in Europe, it seems that Hidalgo uses a bit of manneristic imagery in this painting. There are the writhing images of the captive souls, and Charon himself embodies, if you will, their torment. He is not a placid figure representing death, a hooded skeleton, as he is sometimes shown in popular media or other paintings as well. He is a reminder of death being inescapable and final. If you look at his crouching movement over here, he very much looks like a tormentor, not only a ferryman. If you look at his oar, and this stood out after looking at this painting for a little bit, there's a little bit of curvature here. That could be the natural curvature of the oar. It could be that he's moving it and therefore showing some sort of wavy pattern as it's moving. But I thought it looked like, at least to me, this part right here of the oar began to look like a blade, of a Grim Reaper's blade in that sense. So Charon is not only the ferryman, but he is also he who brings you what the inescapability of death. This is the default setting I mentioned a couple of paintings ago of pantheism, mentioned in the very first slide, absent a Judeo-Christian worldview. Paganism does not leave room for a God who surrenders his omnipotence in any manner, via the gift of free will, which promises a more profound state of happiness. Small aside here. If you're familiar, I mentioned the Homer's Iliad more than once today. There's a character from Homer's Iliad who is the high king of all the Greeks, and that is King Agamemnon, whose mission it is to take Troy. On the surface, to save the honor of his brother, King Menelaus, but really to gain this great city, which has eluded him for a great many years, to be the king of all he surveys across the Mediterranean. The ancient Greeks, unlike people with a more Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic mindset, do not really believe in an afterlife where you will be rewarded for your good actions on this earth. Yes, there is a place called the Elysian Fields, but you usually get there if you have some sort of special favor with some gods. Generally speaking, once you die in the Greco-Roman world, you end up in the underworld. There is a scene not from Dante, but rather from the Odyssey, I believe, where Ulysses meets these souls of men who he fought with to take Troy. And he notices that in the underworld, people are reduced to essentially becoming shades, shadows, with a sense of meaninglessness. You're just wandering through eternity, through the underworld, with no great reward, no peace, And perhaps if you've offended the gods in a greater form or manner, well, you end up like poor Sisyphus, tormented by having to perform a certain action over and over again, but because of your fate. So with this kind of worldview, where you have no God who is benevolent, who is willing to give you the gift of having free will, you have this overbearing sense of fate in the Greco-Roman world. And if you combine what is happening in this particular painting with what is mentioned in the very first section of the presentation there on pantheism, which is, we created these gods to explain nature. They were anthropomorphic first, and then they became more and more abstract. If the gods of the Greeks, according to Lewis, that we in a pantheistic way created to make sense of nature, if they were not forgiving to us then, because after all, you ended up on Charon's boat, how would this newly evolved pantheistic God, who is now an abstract, who now has less empathy towards human beings, how would that be even more beneficial? There is now a sense of perhaps negligence, of not even caring of what happens to you or to us as human beings. This scene reminded me of a line from G.K. Chesterton. I've covered Chesterton more than once, I believe, in these presentations. He's always a great source to draw from. Chesterton once said, interesting line, "The comedy of man survives the tragedy of man." Before I get any further with this point, any thoughts as to why Chesterton would say that? How does that make sense? That the comedy of man survives the tragedy of man.
Human beings can be kind of ludicrous sometimes in their pretensions. Perhaps that's what he's referring to.
You mean the comedy being us being ludicrous?
Yes, we're laughable sometimes.
Okay.
I think he means the happiness. We have to be at some level content or happy, or we would all commit suicide.
Okay, so that the sense of happiness, whether it's tapped into potentially or we're already happy, outweighs our potential sadness on this mortal coil, so to speak.
I think it may also refer to the fact that life is not a tragedy, but in fact, it would have to be, if you're categorizing things as either tragedy or comedy, because of the hope of the resurrection and things like that, this actually turns out to be a happy ending for people instead of the tragic sense that it's all for nothing.
Right.
Also, Chesterton loves paradox, right? But here he's coming down on the side of happiness or joy, and he's always, well, he's not always, but oftentimes he will refer to how people often miss the mirth of God. And
yes.
so I think that's also what's coming in there, right?
Great point. Just in what you just last said, there is supposedly in Germany a school of music where there is a plaque outside the wall of this particular music school. That on the plaque it was written, "Bach gave us God's word, Mozart gave us God's laughter, and Beethoven gave us God's fire." So the element of laughter that Mozart so captures, in those sort of lilting, that lilting part of his music. Here's how this sort of makes sense with regard to the painting. The ancient Greco-Roman worldview has been described by many scholars as tragic. Tragedy, if we remember how it works mechanically from the Greek, yes, tragedy almost always involves a fall, a descent. Something begins at a more or less high position and ends up later on at a very low position. One of the most famous, of course, Aristotle considered Sophocles to be the greatest of the Greek tragedians. Sophocles was in between Aeschylus, who was older, and Euripides, who was a little bit younger. Euripides, his tragedies can sometimes be described as being pointless. I covered a little bit of the Bacchae of Euripides that was in Mere Christianity last year. What makes Sophocles unique is his ability to say that human pain and suffering is not only caused by the gods cursing you, and not only caused by your own personal failings, but sometimes they can be both. Most famous, of course, the story of Oedipus Rex. Oedipus, the king of course, does kill his own father and marries his mother, but he doesn't know this. Why that play is so brilliant is you're watching the play. Essentially, you know what the joke is. And you're seeing this person slowly devolve into this wretched state of realizing how horrible his life has become. So, beginning at a high point, he becomes a king, obviously, yes, and he's married his mother, but then it all goes downhill from there. Comedy works the opposite way. Most famous, of course, the Divine Comedy of Dante. You start off at a low point and you end up at a high point. So, how do we make sense with this painting as well? These poor damned souls on Charon's boat on the river Acheron. Chesterton is saying, and I think Lewis hints at this also, that in the old worldview, there is really only tragedy because there is no divine transcendent being, especially if you're a pantheist. Remember again, if you're a pantheist, you don't believe in anything beyond nature. If you are a pantheist, essentially everything devolves into this state of sinking further and further until you finally meet Charon. But with this Judeo-Christian worldview that Chesterton and Lewis were very fond of, obviously, it is an ascent because God gives us this chance. If we are open to it, if we are open to say, okay, I put aside my hubris, I put aside whatever sort of discrepancies or challenges I may have to this possibility, especially with regard to miracles. If I am open, then maybe there's this way out of this almost assuredly downhill descent. That is the first gift as that makes us open to miracles, this ability to, well, this inheriting of free will from this vast omnipotence of God the Father. Now, let me share the second gift and our last quote for the evening. This is found on page 208 of the book, and I'll share with you the chapter. It is still the grand miracle, and it's close to the end of the chapter, a couple of pages before the end of the chapter. On page 208, the paragraph begins with, so much for the sense in which, so much for the sense in which. Okay, so I'll go from this one. So much for the sense in which human death is the result of sin and the triumph of Satan. But it is also the means of redemption from sin, God's medicine for man and his weapon against Satan. In a general way, it is not difficult to understand how the same thing can be a masterstroke on the part of one combatant, and also the very means whereby the superior combatant defeats him. Every good general, every good chess player, takes what is precisely the strong point of his opponent's plan and makes it the pivot of his own plan. That is followed up by another quote 2 pages over on page 210. Middle of the page, it's one whole paragraph, but middle of the page on 210, our enemy so welcomed, becomes our servant. Bodily death, the monster, becomes blessed spiritual death to self, if the spirit so wills, or rather if it allows the spirit of the willingly dying God so to will in it. It is a safety device because, once man has fallen, natural immortality would be the one utterly hopeless destiny for him. Aided to the surrender that he must make by no external necessity of death, free, if you call it freedom, to rivet faster and faster about himself, through unending centuries, the chain of his own pride. In last Wednesday's presentation, Lewis posits the eternality of God's mind. How it's not an emerging God, as the pantheists would say, yes, something that comes to be a little bit later on in time. Rather, the mind of God is always existing at all times. How this always existing being is beyond the constraints of space and time. Space and time would hem in the emergent God. The emergent God happens within space and time, but is not capable of affecting a supernatural God. This was seen in visual form last week when we met in the painting by Jacob Jordan's Holy Family painting. This divinity called God is unbound by time. Unlike his creations, he never did not exist. He was always in existence. And is able, here's where the gift comes in, is able to bring about goodness after error is created by his creations. You've probably heard of Augustine's answer when, during his time, people would criticize Christianity and say, if your God is so loving, why would he allow evil? And of course, Augustine's response is he doesn't make evil. He basically says, you have free will to choose my way or the other way. And that's what brings about evil, is our choice. Aquinas says that God allows evil so that a greater good may come forth. So it is possible that something better would come forth. And the great evil in this situation is death, that of course comes about after the very first slide for today, the fall of man. Death here can be seen as the triumph of an earlier spiritual creation, what was once called Lucifer and is now called Satan. A triumph of that being over a younger creation, which is spirit and matter, what we are. Yet it is also the manner through which human error is remedied. If I could bring in a bit of John Milton's Paradise Lost. In Milton's Paradise Lost, death is literally the daughter of the devil. Before he is Satan, he is still Lucifer, the seraphim, who chooses to say no to serving God and is very envious of this new love that God has for this new creation of humanity. Death springs from his head. It is a female being. There is an incestuous relationship between the two, and from this union comes forth a monster, death, who both, by the way, Lucifer and his daughter Sin are both afraid of, because death brings about the ending of their existence, or of any existence. Sin, therefore, as Christ would say, of course, in the Gospels, leads to death. Lewis, however, posits that this monster of death can be turned around. In a manner, bodily death leads to death to self, which originally was brought about sin in the first place. If we allow the Spirit of Jesus as he's dying to work its will through us, if we are open to that, this was and is the remedy of our original sin or error, without which immortality in this condition would have meant eternal suffering. This act of willing surrender is parallel to our own relationship to miracles. In a sense, we say to God, your will be done. Our last visual of today. This painting is from 1500 and is by the great Venetian artist Giovanni Bellini. It is called Christ Blessing. Bellini lived between 1438 and 1516. He was the teacher of the more famous Titian. I've shared some Titian works in past presentations. While the latter, Titian, was known for his dramatic use of color, especially blue and red. Titian's reds, by the way, are quite dramatic to view. Bellini excelled in the use of light and by conveying a very, very interesting human state of existence, if you will. If you've seen Raphael works before, by the Raphael of Urbino, who is featured in the Vatican, also his paintings at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Raphael is known for being able to convey, he's very rare, by the way, I can't think of anybody else, but Raphael can convey grace, a certain happiness and gentleness with his human figures that he paints. Whereas Raphael does that, what Bellini does is very unique. The nickname, by the way, for Venice, that it had for a very long time when it was a republic, it was called La Serenissima, the serene one. And by the way, if you ever go to Venice, it is it is one of those few places in the world where your mouth will stop moving, because it's just so splendid to see, so beautiful to see. Bellini had the talent to show us a sense of serenity and peace in his paintings. I forgot to mention, this is found at the, of all places, Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. A very small museum, but a very, very good museum. My wife and I were there some time back. It is well worth the visit if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Apart from Fort Worth, Bellini's masterworks can be found, of course, in Venice. Two locations, if you want to look them up, should you travel there. On the western portion of Venice, there is the Franciscan Church, Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. The Frari Church is called F-R-A-R-I. There, Titian himself is buried. And his famous Madonna Ascending to Heaven is the centerpiece of the altar there at the Frari Church. But Bellini has a section devoted to him. He has a beautiful triptych. Triptychs are these sort of panels where you have a central piece and two pieces on the side, three pieces essentially. And another church is the San Zaccaria, the Saint Zachary Church, found in the eastern portion of Venice, where we find Bellini's works housed. The famed German artist Albrecht Dürer, when he visited Venice the year that Bellini died in 1506, was to have said, in quotations, Bellini is very old, yet he is the best painter of all. So commendations from fellow artists of the time in the form of Dürer. From the Kimball Museum's description of this painting, let's go over a couple of pieces. There's a very small bird up here on this branch of a tree.
Yeah.
It is symbolic of the Old Covenant, now, of course, being completed by the New Covenant. The rabbits on the lower left-hand side represent regeneration. There are three figures, they're quite small, but there are three female figures making their way away from where Jesus is. These are the three Marys, if you will, who are bringing the news of the resurrection. Jesus is holding, it doesn't show the complete picture, and I think it's meant by Bellini. This is a flag. What is at the top of the flag is essentially a white field with a red cross, symbolic of the triumph of Jesus over death. And on his head, we can see rays, showing the divinity of the risen Christ. That is from the description in the Kimball Art Museum. Here's my own observations from what I've seen from this piece. The first is, if we focus on the face of Jesus, there is a serene expression on his face with level eyes. And the eyes, by the way, what make them even more placid is the width, the spread between them. That they are also looking directly eye level. Where this painting is placed, it is the head of Jesus is basically eye level with you. This reminds me, in a way, looking at our level, God now resurrected, looking at us at our own eye level. It reminds me of the wording of the Ten Commandments, uniquely enough, from the Old Testament. The wording where, as the commandments are given to Moses, it always begins with you. And the you here is not Moses only. It's not only some people he's telling this message to. The you here is very personal. It is God engaging with us one-to-one. You ought not do these things. I get this sense of a God who really cares about humanity from this painting of God essentially looking straight at us. And by the way, it's one of those paintings that if you move left to right, different directions from it, you see basically that it's still looking at you in that same way. The use of light mentioned earlier by Bellini. Second thing that stood out to me, the wounds on the hand, very faint, but still there. And the side. By the way, small sign of the light, yes. His arm is casting a shadow, if you will, over here. Very clever work by Bellini. The wounds here are very faint, but they look like they've been healed. They're still visible. They have not disappeared because it has to be conveyed to us as the audience for this painting, or viewers of this painting, that a price was indeed paid for human sin. But healing points to God's mind and will, which provided a miraculous remedy for his creation. Lewis is, through making us think about miracles, we think of this process. God's act of surrender, this grand miracle, his crucifixion and resurrection, shows us, in a way, to be open to surrender, in a sense, to God's will. And this is made possible by the death, which originally had been the great weapon of Satan. God's mind is able to turn that around, so to speak. If you've ever seen a martial art called, if I use the word, jiu-jitsu, where you take the momentum of somebody else and you turn it against them. This is God essentially doing that, taking the great weapon of the enemy and saying, no, I can still, like Thomas Aquinas says, I can still bring about a greater good from this. There are two quotes I'd like to end with before we go to further questions. And they kind of stood out a couple of days ago when I was researching how to conclude the talk. There is one line from Genesis, this being Genesis 4:7. I'll share this with you. The first quote from Genesis 4:7. This is God talking to Cain. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. You're probably familiar with this, yes? This is told to Cain before he allows himself, sadly, to be mastered by sin, and then kills Abel, his brother. The imperative by God the Father, of course, in Eden to Cain is, post-Eden to Cain is, there is the danger for wrongness or sin always lurking there, but you can master it if you put your mind to it, yes? But let me give you a second quote that complements that. This is from Saint Therese of Lisieux, France. Herself a saint of the 19th and 20th century. Jesus does not demand great action from us, but simply surrender and gratitude. Jesus does not demand great action from us, but simply surrender and gratitude. Think of the wording. We can master sin. We are encouraged by God to master sin. But here's where a little bit of Chesterton creeps in, a little bit of paradox creeps in. Mastering sin requires surrendering to what God wills. It's an act of humility. It is, in a sense, what Chesterton, who by the way influenced Lewis to a great degree, would call wonder. Being as a child looking at the world, removing cynicism and viewing things with surprise and post-surprise gratitude. It is my estimation that what Lewis is conveying in Miracles is to allow ourselves this bit of room to have wonder, to be humble enough, perhaps, to be open enough, to say, I may not be able to figure all of this out. And if something happens that I can't explain, that my mind, with all of its training, with all of its education, cannot somehow master, that I can still allow room for this to be in existence. This, I've come to, at least at reading Miracles, is perhaps what Lewis is trying to get us to see. Very happy to address questions or comments.
First of all, that's magnificent. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
But the room for this to be in existence is the miracle. Mm-hmm. For mastery over sin, for joy over tragedy, for expectation over despair. Mm-hmm. That's the miracle. Lewis doesn't at all convince me of naturalistic miracles, and I'm not sure he's trying to.
No, right.
That's to me, it's irrelevant, frankly. Okay. But the miracle is the death to self business that you were talking about. That the contemplation of human death, which I do now that I'm over 70, I have a lot more contemplation of death. Okay. Allows me to ask for death to self instead of seeking pleasure or seeking selfish things.
Right. So you're saying that is the one great miracle we can focus on.
Yes.
That we be open to.
Yes.
In that sense. Very good. It is something, yes, that really, it's a big ask, so to speak. When you think about it, that is the great difficulty with pantheists or moderns, is when they can't or won't grasp the concept of someone who actually cheats death. In that sense, yes. In a pantheistic view of life, everything is within space and time. So how could something do what is impossible? Well, Lewis is saying, as improbable as it sounds, if you close yourself off, you'll never really get it, right? I mean, I think in The Great Divorce, Lewis talks about hell as basically you're locking yourself in a room, with no connection to anything else. You're completely isolating, and you're saying, "I'm so smart, there is no possibility of anything else, defying my intellect." But Lewis is asking us, in a way, in Miracles, to allow a bit of wonder, a bit of possibility or potential for something that suspends our expectations or our intellect in that sense. Excellent input on your part. Thank you. Any other questions or comments on this?
I have a question about that Bellini painting. This is Mark.
Yes.
Jesus' hand has two fingers pointing to the bird, which is the old covenant.
Right.
The other two fingers are pointing to Jesus, which is presumably the new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a deliberate message from Bellini, isn't it? It's not an accidental thing I'm observing.
It's a very subtle message that you bring up, yes? It's sort of a that you really have to see, but also a very profound one. There's a saying, I remember teaching this one year in philosophy class when I was still on-site teaching. And it was the saying that the law was given, the old covenant, that grace may be sought. The new covenant is grace was given, grace in the form of the new covenant was given that the law would be fulfilled. In a sense, pointing at the old, we can't do it ourselves, right? It goes back to the idea of Christ being both priest and sacrifice. We are incapable of doing this ourselves. As independent as we think we are, with all of our achievements, and they're considerable, this feeds into a sense of hubris at a certain point, which we have to avoid.
Did you say that that's St. Mark's bell, the Venetian tower there?
It could be. It doesn't, to be honest, it could be St. Mark's. My memory of St. Mark's is a little bit more rounded looking than these buildings.
It's been up and down many,
Right.
many times.
Okay.
I believe, what was the year for this painter?
It was 1500.
Okay.
Yeah.
They were working on it at that point.
Sure. Right.
Yeah, because they were, I mean, it was constantly falling down and being rebuilt. So, yeah.
And inspired by Hagia Sophia, I believe, was San Marco. The sort of the Byzantine architecture on the inside.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, if you do have a chance to visit, San Marco is one of those. Eric, are you pointing at something?
This is the interior of St. Mark's, right there.
Okay. All right. It was one of those very interesting experiences for my wife and myself when we went to San Marco. Having been to many Gothic churches, San Marco is very much in that Greek tradition of making you contemplate. So much of it is gold and rounded on the inside. Yes. It's a separate message from Gothic art, wherein you are drawn to look upwards and think of higher things. In a more Greek or Byzantine way, you're being asked to contemplate in a Platonic sense, perhaps. Any other questions at all on the subject matter of miracles? More than happy to address. Well, thank you very much. It's a small miracle you've been bear with me this far. I very much appreciate it. I count it as one. I hope you have the rest of the evening a very nice one. And we'll prepare something special for next year as well.